In this video, we'll be looking at three LOS. A, demonstrate the application of the Code of Ethics and Standards of Professional Conduct to situations involving issues of professional integrity. B, distinguish between conduct that conforms to the code and standards and conduct that violates the code and standards. And finally, C, recommend practices and procedures designed to prevent violations of the Code of Ethics and Standards of Professional Conduct. Standard 5, Investment Analysis, Recommendations, and Action. Substandard A, Diligence and Reasonable Basis. Standard 5A, Diligence and Reasonable Basis. There's two parts to this. Members and candidates must 1. Exercise diligence, independence, and thoroughness in analyzing investments, making investment recommendations, and taking investment actions. And 2. Have a reasonable and adequate basis supported by appropriate research and investigation for any investment analysis, recommendation, or action. So some of the highlights with regards to this standard are defining diligence and reasonable basis, using secondary or third-party research, using quantitatively oriented research, developing quantitatively oriented techniques, selecting external advisors and sub-advisors, and group research and decision-making. Guidance for Standard 5A, Diligence and Reasonable Basis. Make reasonable efforts to cover all relevant issues when arriving at an investment recommendation. Level of diligence will depend on the product or service offered. Continuing with the guidance, using secondary or third-party research, determine soundness of the research, review the assumptions, the rigor, the timeliness, and independence of the analysis. Encourage the firm to adopt policy of periodic review of quality of third-party research regarding assumptions, timeliness, rigor, objectivity, and independence. Recommended procedures for Standard 5A, Diligence and Reasonable Basis. Establish policy that research and recommendations should have reasonable and adequate basis. Review and approve research reports and recommendations prior to external circulation. Continuing with the recommended procedures for Standard 5A, Diligence and Reasonable Basis, establish due diligence procedures for judging if recommendation has met reasonable and adequate basis criteria. Develop measurable criteria for assessing quality of research. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Consider scenarios outside recent experience to assess downside risk of quantitative models. And make sure firm has procedures to evaluate external advisors they use or promote, including how often to review. Continuing with the recommended procedures, written procedures of acceptable scenario testing, range of scenarios, cash flow sensitivity to assumptions and inputs. Procedure for evaluating outside information providers, including how often. And no need to disassociate from group research that the member disagrees with. And that's the last slide for Standard 5A, Diligence and Reasonable Basis. Thank you.